He had power. He had money. But when he fell, no one could save him, until a black maid spoke, and the world went silent. In the glittering world of billionaires, pride is worth more than money. But when one man's empire crumbled, before powerful eyes, silence filled the room. No deal, no billions, no influence could save him. Yet from the shadows of his own mansion, a voice rose. A black maid, invisible to his world of wealth, stepped forward. And in that moment, she not only saved him, but taught everyone what true power looks like. This is their story. The city lights glimmered like diamonds scattered across. Velvet darkness. At the very top of a glass tower that seemed to pierce the night sky sat Richard Kingsley, one of the richest men alive. His wealth was counted not in millions, but in billions. People bowed at his presence. His signature could build empires, and his silence could crush competitors. But tonight, in the hushed air of his towering boardroom, all that power felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Richard's suit was perfect, tailored from the finest Italian wool. His gold cufflinks gleamed under the cold light of the chandelier. The boardroom table stretched long, polished like a mirror, reflecting faces of investors from around the world. Men and women in power suits watched him with cold eyes, waiting. Papers were spread out, contracts ready, but something was wrong. His voice, the voice that once commanded nations, trembled. His hands, which never knew defeat, were restless. He tried to speak, but his words fell flat, fragile like glass. The deal in front of him was not just any deal, it was the crown jewel, the merger that was supposed to secure his empire for decades to come. Billions were on the line. More than that, his reputation was at stake. And yet, as the minutes dragged on, he could feel himself failing. Numbers slipped from his tongue, arguments stumbled, investors exchanged glances, unimpressed. The air grew thick, heavy with judgment. At the corner of the room, unnoticed as always, stood Maya. She was dressed in her crisp uniform, white apron against dark fabric, her hair neatly tied back. Maya was a maid, invisible in this world of power. She was there to serve water, clear glasses, and remain silent. To Richard, to his guests, she was a shadow. But her eyes saw everything. She watched the billionaire stumble. Watched. The investors smirk, and something in her chest tightened. She had seen men like these before. Powerful, arrogant, yet fragile when pride was broken. Richard's voice cracked. I assure you, gentlemen, this deal is the future. His words rang hollow. The investors leaned back, unimpressed. One of them, a tall man with a sharp jaw and sharper tongue, sneered. Mr. Kingsley, if this is your pitch, I'm afraid your empire is already crumbling. Laughter rippled around the table. Richard's face burned crimson. Humiliation washed over him like a tidal wave. Maya lowered her gaze, gripping the tray in her hands tighter. She had worked in this mansion for years, silently watching the billionaire's world of excess. She knew his triumphs, his arrogance, his loneliness. And now she was watching his fall. A fall so public, so brutal, that it echoed through the very walls of the skyscraper. But in her heart, something stirred. Not pity, not judgment, but a quiet knowing. She had once lived in a world where words mattered more than wealth, and tonight, words might be the only thing that could save him. The meeting dragged on, each passing moment a dagger into Richard's pride. Investors raised, questions he couldn't answer. They quoted numbers he failed to defend. Papers shuffled, whispers spread. He felt smaller and smaller, his empire slipping from his hands. For the first time in his life, Richard Kingsley, the man who had everything, had nothing. At last, silence fell. The investors looked ready to leave, the deal all but dead. Richard leaned back in his chair, defeated, sweat glistening on his brow. And then, a sound broke the silence. It was not the voice of an investor, not the voice of an advisor. It was soft, steady, and unexpected. "Excuse me, sir." Every head in the room turned. There, at the corner, stood Maya. Her hands still clutched the tray, but her eyes no longer looked down. They were fixed, steady, sharp as fire. The room froze. A maid had spoken. Richard blinked. "Maya?" The investors frowned, confused. Who was this woman? Why was she speaking? But before anyone could stop her, Maya took a step forward. Her voice was calm, yet it carried across the grand room like a bell. "Forgive me," she said, "but perhaps you're all missing something important." Gasps rippled through the room. A maid, daring to speak? Investors shifted uncomfortably. Some chuckled mockingly, but Maya didn't flinch. She placed the tray down gently on the table, her eyes scanning the men who had just humiliated her employer. "You talk about numbers," she continued, her tone sharp yet graceful, "about profits and losses. But none of you are looking at the people. This deal isn't about figures on paper. It's about futures, families, the trust of thousands who depend on this empire." Her words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. The laughter faded. The smirks disappeared. For the first time all night, silence meant respect. Richard stared at her, stunned. This was his maid, the woman he never noticed, the woman who walked quietly through his halls, unseen. And yet, in this moment, she stood taller than him, stronger than all of them. The investors leaned in, their expressions shifting. They were listening. To her, not him. And in that instant, Richard realized something. He was not the hero of this night. She was. The silence that followed Maya's words was unlike anything Richard had ever experienced. In boardrooms, silence usually meant weakness, hesitation before a strike. But this silence was different. It was heavy, electrifying, as if every man and woman seated at that long, polished table had suddenly been caught off guard by a storm they didn't see coming. The investors' eyes, once glued to Richard with disdain, now shifted toward Maya, a maid, a woman they hadn't even registered, when they entered the room. She had been invisible, and yet, in a single moment, her voice had pierced through arrogance, through billions, through power itself. One of the investors, an older man with silver hair and a smirk permanently etched onto his face, leaned forward. His tone was laced with mockery. And what exactly would a maid know about multi-billion-dollar mergers? The others chuckled under their breath, relieved someone had broken the spell of her words. Richard's heart sank. He knew what came next. They would tear her apart, humiliate her, turn her into another reminder of his failure. But Maya didn't flinch. Her gaze met the older man's, unshaken. "Maybe I don't know the technicalities of mergers," she said softly, her voice calm but cutting. "But I know people. And at the end of the day, all of you, even billionaires, depend on people who trust you. Without that trust, your numbers mean nothing." The silver-haired investor's smirk faltered. The chuckles died down again. Richard leaned forward unconsciously, captivated. He had given hundreds of speeches in his career. He had convinced presidents, outwitted rivals, closed impossible deals. But never, never had he spoken with the conviction Maya had in this moment. Another investor, a woman in a sharp navy suit, crossed her arms. Her tone was skeptical, but her eyes betrayed curiosity. "So, what are you suggesting? That trust matters more than profit?" Maya tilted her head, her calmness unbroken. I'm suggesting that profit is only possible when trust exists. Break it and you won't have either. The words landed with weight. The investors exchanged looks, some skeptical, some thoughtful. A few even shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Richard's chest tightened. How did she do it? How did a woman who scrubbed floors and polished tables, who had never studied finance or economics, understand the very foundation of business better than the men and women who lived in it? The silver-haired man scoffed, trying to regain control. Bold words for someone who cleans up after others. For the first time, Maya smiled. Not out of arrogance, but out of unshakable confidence. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I clean up after others. I see the messes that powerful men leave behind. And if you think I don't understand the cost of greed and carelessness, you're mistaken. I've seen what happens when trust is broken. I've lived it." The room froze again. Richard's heart pounded. There was something in her tone, a weight, a story untold, but powerful enough to silence even the cruelest mockery. The woman in the navy suit leaned forward now, her skepticism fading into interest. "Then tell us," she said. "What would you do? If you were in charge of this deal, how would you handle it?" Richard felt his breath catch. This was it, the moment everything could turn. Maya took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the table. Her voice softened, but its strength only grew. "I would remind everyone here that this isn't just about numbers. It's about lives. The workers in your factories, the families depending on paychecks, the communities relying on stability. If you want this deal to succeed, you don't start by showing profit margins. You start by showing people that their future is safe, that their trust is in the right hands. Because without that trust, your billions mean nothing." Her last words rang out like thunder. Without meaning to, Richard whispered them under his breath. Billions mean nothing. The investors sat in silence, their confident facades cracking. The silver-haired man shifted in his seat, his smirk gone. The woman in navy tapped her pen slowly against the table, lost in thought. Another man at the far end leaned forward, studying Maya as if she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. And Richard felt something stir in him that he hadn't felt in years, hope. He had walked into this meeting certain he would lose. His words had failed him, his empire had slipped through his grasp, and humiliation had consumed him. But in the quiet strength of his Maid, he saw something no billions could buy. The room remained silent until finally, the woman in navy spoke again. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "She makes a point. If this deal is going to work long-term, trust is critical. Perhaps, Mr. Kingsley, your company has been focusing too much on figures, not enough on people." The investors murmured among themselves, nodding slightly. The atmosphere had shifted. Where once there had been mockery, there was now thought, curiosity, maybe even respect. Richard looked at Maya, his throat tight. She stood with her back straight, hands steady, her presence commanding the room. A maid, the woman he had overlooked for years. And yet, in this moment, she was the only one saving him. One of the investors finally broke the silence. "Mr. Kingsley," he said, his tone different now, almost respectful. "Perhaps we should hear more from her." Richard blinked, stunned. The investors, men and women worth billions, leaders of industries, were asking to hear from his Maid. Maya didn't move. She didn't boast, didn't gloat. She simply waited, her calm gaze steady. And Richard knew, with every fiber of his being, that the balance of power had shifted. For the first time in his life, Richard Kingsley was not the man in control of the room. She was. The air inside the room was thick with a kind of tension Richard had never felt before. All his life, he had been the one to control silence, to bend it into a weapon, to use it as a tool to pressure opponents into submission. But now, The silence did not belong to him. It belonged to her. To Maya. The investors, worth more money than entire countries, leaned forward in their leather chairs, their eyes glued to the maid who only minutes ago had been invisible to them. Richard could see the shift in their expressions. The mockery was gone. The arrogance had faded. Instead, there was curiosity, even a faint respect, as though they were witnessing something none of them had prepared for. Maya stood still, her presence commanding without effort. She wasn't loud, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and the investors could not ignore them. One of the younger investors, his tie loosened and his expression softened, cleared his throat. "You speak about trust as though it were currency," he said cautiously. "But in this room, trust doesn't sign checks. Profit does." Maya's eyes met his, calm and unwavering. "Profit lasts only as long as trust allows it," she replied. "When trust breaks, profit vanishes faster than air leaving a room. You've all seen it. A company valued in the billions one day, destroyed overnight because no one trusted it anymore." The man froze. He couldn't argue. Everyone in the room knew she was right. They had seen scandals collapse empires. They had watched CEOs fall, their fortunes vanish, their names dragged through mud. Richard sat in silence watching her. Every word she spoke hit him like a wave. She wasn't just saving him. She was teaching him lessons he had ignored all his life. Another investor leaned forward, the silver-haired man who had mocked her earlier. His smirk was gone now, replaced by something harder, more calculating. "And what do you think we should do, Maid? Are you telling us we've been running our businesses wrong?" Maya didn't blink. "I'm telling you that if you keep treating people like they're disposable, one day you'll wake up and realize your billions can't protect you. Not from public outrage, not from failure, not from the collapse that comes when no one believes in you anymore." Her words were sharp, but her tone remained even. She wasn't attacking. She was warning. The silver-haired man opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He sat back slowly, his jaw tight. The woman in the navy suit spoke next, her tone thoughtful. "You said earlier that you've lived it. What did you mean by that?" Richard tensed. He wanted to stop her, to protect Maya from being dragged deeper into this brutal world of billionaires and their pride. But Maya lifted her chin, ready. "My father," she began softly. "He worked for a company his whole life, gave them everything, his sweat, his health, his loyalty. One day, when profits dipped, they cut him loose. No warning, no gratitude, just numbers on a sheet that said he wasn't worth keeping. I watched him break. Not because he lost his job, but because he realized his trust had meant nothing to them." The room went still. Her voice didn't crack, but the weight of her words pressed on everyone like a storm. Even Richard felt his throat tighten. He had fired countless people without thought. To him they were numbers, expenses, sacrifices for the greater profit. But to Maya, it had been her life, her pain. She looked around the table, her eyes sharp. "That's what happens when you forget trust. You don't just ruin numbers, you ruin people. And eventually people fight back. They walk away. They take down everything you've built." Her last words landed like a gavel striking wood. Richard felt chills crawl up his arms. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a billionaire sitting at the top of the world. He felt like a man staring into the truth he had ignored for too long. The younger investor leaned back, exhaling slowly. "She's right," he murmured. "Markets crash not because of numbers, but because of trust. When trust dies, value dies." The others nodded, murmuring in agreement. Even the silver-haired man's face had softened, his jaw unclenched. Richard swallowed hard, his gaze flicking between Maya and the investors. This was it. The moment his empire might be saved, not by his brilliance, not by his power, but by her, by a woman who had once been invisible in this very room. The woman in navy turned to Richard, her voice steady. "Mr. Kingsley, it seems your maid understands the heart of business better than you have shown today. Perhaps you should let her speak for you." Richard's stomach flipped. A part of him screamed in humiliation. Him, a billionaire, a man who had built empires, now told to let his maid take the stage. But another part of him, the part that had felt the sting of his failures, the weight of his arrogance, whispered the truth. She was right. Maya was the only one holding this together. He looked at Maya. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply looked back at him with calm, waiting. And for the first time in his career, Richard Kingsley did something he had never done before. He surrendered control. "Then let her speak," he said quietly. His voice cracked, but his words were clear. "Let Maya speak." A ripple of shock moved across the room. Investors straightened in their seats, eyebrows raised. The silver-haired man shifted uncomfortably, but no one objected. Maya inhaled deeply. Slowly, she stepped forward, moving past Richard until she stood where he had once stood, at the head of the table, facing the wealthiest, most powerful people in the city. Her hands didn't shake, her voice didn't waver. She looked each of them in the eye and began. "You asked me what I would do, so listen carefully. If you want this deal to succeed, you have to prove to the world that this merger isn't about greed. It's about people. Show them that you're not destroying livelihoods for profit, but protecting them. Prove that your billions aren't just numbers, but a promise to stand by the people who built your empire in the first place." The words flowed from her like fire, strong, relentless, beautiful. "You want profits?" she continued, her voice rising slightly. "Then build trust. You want loyalty? Earn it. You want power? Respect the people you hold it over. Because in the end, all the money in the world can't save you when people turn against you. Billions mean nothing when trust is gone." The last sentence struck the room like lightning. The investors sat frozen, their expressions unreadable. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. For a moment, no one spoke, and then, slowly, the woman in navy began to clap. One by one, the others joined. The sound echoed through the room. Not polite, not forced. Genuine. Powerful. Maya stood, still, her eyes calm, her face unshaken. But Richard saw it. The faint shimmer in her eyes. The quiet storm of emotion she held back. For the first time, his empire wasn't standing because of him. It was standing because of her. And for the first time, Richard Kingsley wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, he had finally seen what true power looked like. The sound of clapping faded slowly, but the echo of Maya's words lingered in the air long after silence returned. Richard sat frozen, his heart thundering in his chest. He had walked into this room expecting to prove himself yet again as the master of the deal, the unshakable king of the boardroom. Instead, he had been humbled before his own empire, and it was his maid, the woman who scrubbed his marble floors and polished his silver, who had done what he could not. The investors exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly. Some leaned back, thoughtful. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that Richard could barely process it. For the first time, he was not the center of gravity. Maya was. The woman in the navy suit broke the silence first. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Maya. "You speak with conviction, but conviction alone doesn't seal billion-dollar deals. What makes you think your words can convince shareholders? Can sway markets?" Maya's gaze was steady. "Because words move hearts," she said simply, "and hearts move markets." Her voice carried no arrogance, no pretense, just truth. Truth so unshakable that it made the suits in the room pause. The younger investor, the one who had been loosening his tie earlier, smiled faintly, almost in admiration. "She's right," he said quietly. "You can pour billions into marketing, but if people don't believe in you, it all collapses. Trust is the only currency that multiplies without limits." The silver-haired man, still skeptical, narrowed his eyes. "You speak as though people will just forget the failures, the scandals, the arrogance." He flicked his gaze toward Richard, and the sting was undeniable. "Why should anyone believe us now?" Maya's eyes flicked toward Richard for the briefest moment, then back to the investors. "They shouldn't," she said, her tone sharp as steel. "Not yet. Belief isn't handed out, it's earned, and right now, the only thing you can do is earn it back." The bluntness of her words made Richard flinch. No one had spoken to him like that in his entire life. And yet, strangely, he didn't feel anger. He felt relief. Finally, someone wasn't afraid to tell him the truth. Maya continued, her voice growing firmer. "You want to save this empire? Then stop pretending you have all the answers. Admit your mistakes. Own your failures. Show the world that you are not untouchable, that you are willing to change. That is how trust begins again." The room went still. Every eye turned to Richard. He felt the weight of their stares like 1,000 pounds pressing on his shoulders. His pride screamed at him to fight back, to defend himself, to remind them all that he was Richard Kingsley, the man who built skyscrapers from nothing, who turned dust into diamonds. But then his eyes met Maya's. She wasn't challenging him. She wasn't humiliating him. She was giving him a way out, a lifeline, one he had never offered anyone else in his life. Richard inhaled slowly, his chest heavy. He stood, his legs stiff, and faced the room. "For years," he began, his voice low, "I believed that money was enough. That numbers were all that mattered. I fired people without thinking. I crushed competitors without remorse. I built an empire on arrogance and believed it would never fall." The words burned as they left his mouth. He had never admitted weakness. Not once, not in all his years. But now the words flowed, unstoppable. "And it did fall," he continued, his throat tight. "Because I forgot the one thing Maya reminded me of today. Trust. I lost the trust of the people who worked for me, the people who believed in me. And I lost yours." The investors watched, unblinking, some with raised brows, some with softening eyes. Richard glanced at Maya again, her presence steady, grounding him. Then he turned back to the table. "I can't fix that with money," he said, "but I can fix it with change, with humility, with people who see what I couldn't, people like Maya." Maya's breath caught, but she remained composed. "I've asked her to speak for me today," Richard finished, "because she speaks the truth I've been too blind to see. And if you give me the chance, give us the chance, I promise, you will see not just an empire rebuilt, but an empire reborn." The words hung in the air like smoke after fire. The investors shifted. Some whispered. The silver-haired man rubbed his chin, deep in thought. The woman in navy tapped her pen against the table, her expression unreadable. Finally, the younger investor broke the silence. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I came here today ready to walk away, to cut ties. But after hearing both of you, I see something different. A chance. A rare chance for this empire to rise from its ashes stronger than before. I'm in." The words hit Richard like a wave of relief. One by one, the others spoke. "I'm willing to stay. I'll give this another shot. This could work, if you keep her by your side." All eyes turned to Maya again. She stood tall, unshaken, though Richard could see the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. A maid, had just swayed billionaires. The last holdout was the silver-haired man. He leaned forward, folding his hands together, his voice measured. "You've impressed us today, Maid, but words fade, promises fade. If we stay, we expect results, real results. Can you deliver that?" Richard opened his mouth, but Maya spoke first. "Yes," she said firmly. "Not because I have billions, but because I have the truth, and the truth always delivers." The man studied her for a long, tense moment. Finally, he nodded once. "Very well, I'll stay." And just like that, the deal was saved. Richard exhaled, his shoulders collapsing with the weight of it all. He turned to Maya, his voice hoarse. You did it." Maya looked at him quietly, her eyes soft but steady. "No," she said, "we did it. You let me speak when you could have silenced me. That's change. That's the start." For the first time in his life, Richard felt something foreign in his chest. Not pride, not triumph, something deeper. Gratitude. The investors began to gather their things, conversations buzzing, deals shifting. But Richard stayed frozen, his gaze on Maya. He realized something he had never realized before. His billions had never saved him. His empire had never been held up by him alone. It had always been people like Maya, invisible until they spoke, unseen until they rose. And in that moment, Richard Kingsley understood the greatest truth of all. Billions meant nothing, but the right words, spoken at the right time, could save everything. The meeting room slowly emptied. Investors shook hands, some offering polite nods, others stealing one last glance at Maya, the maid who had stolen the stage and rewritten the narrative of the empire. Their footsteps faded down the marble hallway, leaving behind only the faint echo of possibility in the air. Richard stood motionless, his heart still racing. His palms were damp, his chest heavy, but his soul lighter than it had ever been. He turned to Maya, who was now collecting the papers she had nervously clutched at the start of the meeting. Her hands shook slightly, but her face carried the calm of a warrior who had just walked through fire and come out untouched. "Maya," Richard said, his voice almost breaking, "you saved me today." She looked up at him. Her expression was steady, her voice gentle. "No, I saved the truth. You just had the courage to let it live." Richard's throat tightened. He had been praised by presidents, toasted by kings, envied by competitors. Yet never had praise cut so deep, so raw, so real. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then Richard did something he had never done before, something no billionaire in his world would dare to do. He bowed his head, not in defeat, not in shame, but in respect. Maya's eyes widened slightly, but she did not gloat. She did not smile triumphantly. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." The humility in those two words nearly undid him. That evening, the city skyline shimmered, outside Richard's penthouse. The glittering towers that once represented his pride now looked different, like fragile candles flickering in the vastness of the night. Maya entered quietly, carrying a tray of tea. For years, she had walked these halls as if invisible. Tonight, her presence filled every corner of the room. Richard gestured for her to sit. At first, she hesitated. A maid did not sit beside her employer, but the look in his eyes wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Slowly, she sat. "I've spent my life believing money was everything," Richard admitted, his voice soft. "But when I lost everything, it wasn't my billions that saved me. It was you, a woman who had nothing to gain and everything to lose." Maya sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the city lights. "Sometimes," she said, It takes losing everything to finally see what matters. Her words hit him harder than any business lecture ever had. Richard leaned back, his thoughts unraveling. I don't want this to be the end, Maya. You don't belong in the shadows anymore, not cleaning floors while I sit in boardrooms. You belong at the table, beside me. She turned to him, surprised. You mean? Yes, Richard said firmly. I want you as my partner, my advisor, my truth-teller, the one person who will never let me drown in my own pride again. Maya's lips parted, but no words came. Her heart raced. She had never imagined a man like Richard Kingsley, untouchable billionaire, feared tycoon, would ever say those words to her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Slowly she nodded. I'll stay, not for your billions, not for the empire, but because the world needs to see that people like me have a voice. And if you're truly ready to listen, then I'll speak. Richard smiled faintly, the kind of smile he hadn't worn since he was a boy. For once, it wasn't the smile of a victor. It was the smile of a man reborn. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the business world had seen. Press conferences where Richard stood side with Maya, introducing her not as a maid, but as his chief advisor. Boardrooms where billionaires leaned forward, hanging on her words. Headlines that spoke not of scandals and failures, but of redemption and change. And in every photograph, every broadcast, every article, Richard no longer stood alone. Because the empire that had nearly collapsed was not rebuilt by billions. It was rebuilt by a maid with the courage to speak the truth, and a billionaire with the humility to listen. The night came when Richard found himself walking alone on his balcony, the city glittering below. He thought of the empire he almost lost, the arrogance that almost destroyed him, and the woman who had given him back not just his company, but his soul. He whispered into the night, words no one else would hear. Billions meant nothing, until she spoke. Behind him, Maya stepped onto the balcony, the city lights reflecting. In her eyes, and together, billionaire and maid, they looked out at the world they would change.